Today, I'm happy to welcome Chris Crawley, who has obviously, as many of you know, an extensive background in the travel industry and who is currently partner at Mina and Pinta. Chris will talk about his views related to the return to travel as part of our future series that we've started yesterday. And there are, of course, a few more sessions to come during the month of April. We'll inform you as soon as possible with all the details. Just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we are recording this session so that those people that are not able to join us today can look at it and listen to it through our BATM website. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat function of the Zoom application. We will be more than happy, and we will have plenty of time at the end of his presentation to handle those and to discuss those. So with no further ado, Chris, thank you very much for your partnership today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Pascal. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen now with you all, so you can see what I'm going to present. Just bring up the main slide format. Here we go. We've all become experts at this kind of technology, haven't we? Suddenly, in the last year. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you all today. This presentation, curiously enough, was not something that we had ever intended or decided that we would release as a paper or a discussion, but it came out of a number of client engagements that we did in the fourth quarter of 2020, and we noticed some common themes developing in these engagements, both with corporates and suppliers, and these common themes started to inform a way of looking at a timeline for a return to travel. And it was trying to understand a timeline that drove really the presentation and the slides that you're going to see today and what you're going to hear me talk about. We do not have a crystal ball, and we are not all-seeing, all-powerful, or wise, and I will explain carefully the basis on which we have made the predictions that we make them. But I hope you will find this useful today, and that some of the advice and the tips and the areas of focus that we present will be of interest to you. So I'm going to start with doing something that I'm really not going to do for most of the presentation, which is look back a bit at what's happened. We are now at a sort of turning point in this cycle. It's like that moment in the second Lord of the Rings movie where Gandalf reappears after, having been eaten by the big fiery monster thing, and says, this is the turning of the tide. We are now at this moment, I think, at the turning of the tide. But 2020 was the year that changed everything. It was a terribly difficult year for us all. Forget the work issues and the industry issues for a second. As societies, we have suffered terrible loss, terrible hardship, and terrible mental scarring for many of our communities and our individuals, for folks across all kinds of different demographics and backgrounds. And it continues to go on. The first quarter of this year has been pretty rough, to be frank. I mean, January in the UK was awful, close to 30,000 deaths in 1 month, something like that. We've seen similar numbers across many countries around the world, and it continues to be a very difficult situation with what might be a third or fourth wave underway in a lot of European countries at the moment. Difficulties in a coordinated vaccine rollout, issues and problems economically, all kinds of other things going on. We're certainly not coming out of a situation, but 2020 was a very impactful year, and I think we'll remember that year for different reasons for a long time. But it's also important to realize that we can spend a lot of time mourning what we've lost, and it's good to remember and mourn what we've lost, but it's also important to look at opportunities that we can progress and things that we can do better and differently. And there are opportunities in this current situation as we come back to business to do things in a different and more enhanced way, and we'll focus on some of those as we get through the slides. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the significant impacts and what we saw, and that this sort of informs then a little bit some of our predictions. The immediate impact was staggering. I think it's the first time that we've seen business literally fall off a cliff edge globally like this. We're still running at globally at around 18% of global business travel in comparison to pre-COVID numbers. In fact, this year's data may well look a little bit worse than last year's data, because we still had globally a relatively strong first quarter in 2020. And the first quarter, of course, in 2021 has not been like that. We have a lot of people that are not in their offices. Some of them may not ever come back to their offices. And we have a very mixed and varied set of regulations, different waves going on at different times, a lot of very confused and unsure travelers, and lots of people making some quite ferocious predictions about confluence moments in business travel and long-term reductions and impacts. We know that revenue for the supply chain, the loss has been aggressive and severe. Most supply chain players now have resolved their cash position. If they haven't resolved their cash position, they're either going out of business, or they're being sold, or they're about to go out of business. But there's been a significant move in the last year from a number of suppliers to get their cash position clearer and to control their containable costs. But very worryingly, we're seeing a significant number of people leave the industry, especially in the younger generations, which are the generations that we can least afford to lose. A huge amount of de-skilling, as entire departments or groups of skill sets are being let go by the airlines, the TMCs, the hotels, other companies as well. The virtual impact that we've all noticed, which has moved so much of our lives into talking to a computer. I was chatting to a friend the other day, and I said, so what are you doing these days? He said, well, about 40% of the time I talk to a computer screen, about 40% of the time I look after my children, and the other 20% I drink. And we all probably have shared this experience to a great extent in the last year. It's very difficult to see a clear and consistent way through this. It's very hard to make predictions because demand is so variable, because waves come and go, regulation changes, etc. And it's given corporate program managers really a lot to think about. Apart from changing regulation and confidence and things like that, the way that most corporate program managers are currently communicating with the very small number of travelers who, in most cases, who are traveling, is a completely unscalable, over-supportive way of working, which is giving them a lot of concern for how they're going to bring this business back. Insurance and liability on travelers while they're away is a completely unresolved issue at present. Very inconsistent regulation between airports and marketplaces, between different hotel groups and countries and regions. And for travel programs, there's been a lot of concern around business continuity, in particular, sort of assurance of supply. You'll remember the first 6 months, there was a number of audits being conducted across the GDSs, and it became clear that at least 50% of the listed content up to around about the end of August was pretty unreliable in most of the GDS and online booking tools. And there's still a significant amount of unreliable content floating around today. Processes have become really complex. There's a lot more interest from people in travel because it's such a concern, travel on a different number of ways. A lot more senior stakeholders are engaged. And there's a lot of impacts in terms of personalization and customization in the way that we look at and manage our programs. So taking all of this into account, we wanted to try and think about what kind of timetable could we show folks that would give them some way of making some predictions about their business, but also making some planning with suppliers and with stakeholders and executives, and having some kind of timeline view. And when you're making these kinds of predictions as consultants, it's quite a risky thing to do. And you have to be very cautious about a couple of things that you don't, or a couple of traps that you don't fall into. The first one, which is something that we all suffer from in our industry, is optimism bias. We are, by our nature, global community people. We are positive people in general. As one of the colleagues on the call today, Tina, told me several years ago, optimism is a moral duty, and we do look at the world in an optimistic way. We want to do that because we're travel people, and we have to kind of bring that a bit into check, that optimism doesn't color our predictions. We have very little data of actual travel to go on. Most of the forecasts or the analysis that you've seen over the last 12 months has in many cases been based on sentiment-based analysis. Now, sentiment-based analysis is very good at measuring sentiment. It's not necessarily much good for anything else. If you ask somebody how they feel, they will tell you how they feel, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what they will do or how they will feel the next week or a month later or 3 months later. And if we had more time, I could show you the impact on the New York Stock Exchange of different announcements around vaccines over the last 12 months to show you how sentiment can impact dramatically the way that people behave and the way they react to things. We also have to be very cautious that we don't try and impose our own desired facts on reality. There's a quote here in the bottom left from a senator called Daniel Moynihan, which was often used by Barack Obama, where he said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Something we could all do with remembering in the current climate, I think. And wishing just doesn't make it so, because in the end, there is no silver bullet. There's no one single thing that's going to fix this for us. Vaccines on their own will not do it. Testing on its own will not do it. Common regulation on its own will not do it. All of these things have to be brought into play together. And we have to remember that we are a globally dependent business. For international business travel to come back, a number of our countries and our key hubs and airports need to be coming back together. It is no good one or two countries hiding away vaccine pellets thinking they're going to be fine. It doesn't work, right? Everybody has to kind of come back together within a certain demographic. And we spent quite a lot of time looking at data from McKinsey and from Deloitte and various other folks around the traffic and dependency of key hubs and marketplaces around the world. And the conclusion we came to is that there are around 35 or 36 large airport hubs located in roughly 20 countries, which represent between 93 and 96% of global business travel, depending on which way you do the analysis, right? So let's take an average of this and say it's about 95% of business travel is being conducted or emitted or passing through the same 20 countries. Well, that gives you a good basis for understanding what needs to happen for the fluid business travel economy that we all love and desire and want to come back to re-emerge itself. Those markets have to be in tune together. Vaccinations have to progress in all of those markets to a certain standard. There has to be some common testing. There has to be some common regulation. There has to be some common understanding so that people can begin to travel more freely. And frankly, keeping the odd seat free in the plane or cleaning the toilets 3 times instead of twice a day or whatever else we're doing is not going to be sufficient here. These markets have to come back together. And while the markets need to come back together, our networks need to come back together as well. The data from IATA in January that I was looking at in the analysis had the global airline capacity at around and about 54% of pre-COVID numbers. Now, I spoke to a couple of IATA guys at the end of last week, and they think it's actually gone down since then. It's down around 48, 49% now of pre-COVID numbers. So even if we wanted to bring an enormous amount of business back, the network is not there today to do it. The TMCs are not staffed to take reservations. The airlines do not have their routes open or their planes in the right place or their staff in the right uniforms and in the right training. The airports have entire terminals closed or airports closed. And there are indeed a number of businesses on the supply side that simply don't exist anymore, that existed before COVID, where we haven't seen the effect. I'll give you a small example is an airline, a couple of airlines in the UK, very regional airlines, supporting airports like Southampton, Edinburgh, Glasgow. There's these two airlines there that have gone out of business, and we don't actually know the effect of that going out of business yet because nobody's actually traveling to test it. If you live in Luxembourg, which is an airport that has, a lot of secondary routes going into different places, or Geneva or markets like this, you will know that the number of connecting flights available to you has significantly reduced. Your ability to choose your trip, your destination, your route is significantly impacted. So we're also going to see a lot more connections being done with trains and planes together, and I'll come on to that a bit later. So some notes of caution and some dependencies we need to be aware of. Taking all these things into account, we felt confident in being able to make the following kind of simple timeline analysis on how we saw the return to travel. And we decided to look at this in a concept of stages. So that, we thought about 3 stages here. First of all, a kind of in COVID stage, which is where we are today. This is not a break or a pause or a temporary blip. This is now coming onto an 18-month impact timeline. And during this time, we've seen really, from a business travel perspective, just essential travel going on with most companies. There are some exceptions in different industries, but mostly it's essential travel. We've seen a lot of focus on business continuity, both within supplier programs and by suppliers on keeping their businesses going. And we've seen a lot of economic uncertainty. And we think this timeline will continue until at least the 3rd quarter of this year, possibly even a bit longer. And during this time, what we're going to see is a significant amount of vaccine release into different marketplaces. And we're starting to see this now as the pace of vaccine release ramps up. More vaccines being approved, more vaccines being released, more vaccines being produced. And this will take us into a transition period, which will last, we think, around a year, somewhere around 3rd quarter this year to 3rd quarter, maybe even 4th quarter of 22. And we've called this the transition period, and using an old London expression, the hokey cokey. I don't know if you've ever had the good fortune to be drunk in an inappropriate East End London pub, and somebody gets on the piano, they start doing the hokey cokey. The key principle here is that it's in, out, shake it all about. And that's a little bit what we might see here in our COVID situation, is a lot of variable demand, a lot of in and out kind of regulation, a lot of in and out kind of quarantine and lockdown scenarios as we gradually emerge from this. And we'll see vaccines now being deployed with greater speed across a number of key markets, including those core 20 markets that we talked about. At some point in early 23, I would suspect end of 1st quarter, beginning of 2nd quarter 23, will start to emerge into whatever the sunny post-COVID future state is going to be in our business. By now, we'll have seen widespread vaccine deployment in the key markets, including the majority of 2nd injections in most cases, and we may even be seeing 2nd vaccine rollouts for boosters and top-ups where that is a requirement. We're going to see a lot more accepted and common protocols between different areas of supply, more common understanding between airports, more common understanding between hotels, a more common understanding of what a vaccine passport looks like, and what kind of certification we need and how that can be engaged. And all the turmoil of what will happen this year in the supplier market will have settled down a lot more, and we'll see a lot more vendor consistency as well. And part of the core function to make this happen is that we need a kind of herd immunity in the core markets, which means around 70 to 75% of the populations having had both their injections. Now, if you think about where we are today and how long it's going to take us to get to that point, you can see why we have positioned the timeline in the way that we've positioned it. And although this may not be the wildly optimistic timeline that many of you hope for, we think based upon vaccine deployment, based upon network capacity, based upon regulation and return, based upon the ability of companies to send their travelers out, we think this is a relatively reliable timeline that at least you can think around when planning program return. And I've broken it down here into more the language that you might use in a consultancy type engagement with a customer to see the different kinds of activity that should be focused on through these key stages. Short-term contingency, which we're sort of coming through now. I've talked a bit already about cost containment, cash alignment, stuff like that. We're now in a kind of medium-term situation where businesses with underlying health issues, like the airline businesses and the TMCs, are reconsidering commercial models. They're looking at the way that they deploy their technology and their management. They're looking at their routes and their hubs and their centralization. We're going to go into this transition period where we're going to see a lot of behavioral impacts. This is where intermodality will come to play a part as we see modal shifts between rail and air quite a lot more virtual and hybrid working practice solutions, a number of different areas. And as we come into post-COVID, some of the accelerators that we have seen starting to emerge in the last year will really come to the forefront in terms of where our capacity is, what the settled state of our future business volumes might look like, what the future of work is like for many of us with office and home and travel, sustainability and digital transformation, which will accelerate. We don't really see any new themes coming out of COVID. What we see is an acceleration of themes that were already there and needed accelerating and have had extra focus put on them by the COVID situation. And let's talk about a few of those before we come to an end. So based on our timeline, I guess what we're saying to you is this: the business is not really going to come back in significant volumes. We think maybe maximum 40% by the end of this year of pre-COVID, maximum, right? Maybe if we're doing really well, 70% or something like that around the first quarter of 2023. So if you look at this optimistically, to quote my friend Tina, this actually gives you an opportunity to do some very important things in your programs and in your supply management practices. First of all, it gives you a chance to look ahead within a period of relative calm in your business. You should by now have established your cash position. You should by now have established your business continuity preference. So now you can accelerate the evolution of some of these goals and principles that you want to work on and you want to see happen. And you need to get ready for the return to business. The impact on the supply chain of a movement from 18% where it is today just to 30% will be huge. That's a huge return, and it will happen in a series of gluts, we think. It'll be a jump from 18 to 30 and then a teeny tiny slow kind of upwards, and then suddenly from 42 to 55 or something. It'll go like that. And this means that you've really got to be ready for this. And I love the old American boxing fights I used to watch, while my parents thought I was asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the announcer would come on, he'd pull the mic down from the ceiling and he'd say, let's get ready to rumble. And we need to be ready to rumble, folks. We really do. We're ready for the return. So we need to really start engaging every level in our business, nurturing our communities, really thinking with purpose about how we're spending money, how we're looking ahead and what we want to do, and try and be in this very diverse geographical world of hybridity and working from different places. We need to try and be very inclusive in what we're doing. So let's look at a couple of things we can focus on. First of all, sustainability. And here I'd like to talk about sustainability not just as saving some trees or keeping some environment happy, but a wider perspective on sustainability that includes social impact, it includes the environment, it includes talent development within your organizations, it includes diversity, inclusion, and equality, and it includes brand focus. And sustainability for us is all of these things. Sustainability is in many ways a COVID issue, or you could say, conversely, that COVID is a sustainability issue. We would certainly not be in this situation if we were not a globally interconnected community, right? Okay, so our impact on the world around us has directly contributed to the spread of this disease. Now, does that mean we shouldn't travel? No, absolutely not. It doesn't mean that the slightest. But it does mean that we have to be very cognizant of what the impact of what we do is, not just on the environment, but on societies, on ecosystems, on infrastructures, on things like that. And the other thing that's been very prevalent in the last year or so, and I think will carry on, is the way that brands are perceived, brand focuses. We're seeing extraordinary movements in the investor markets as people run away from brands. Just the last week, when the results of some of the investigations into working practices within the Deliveroo, I don't know if any of you use Deliveroo, it's a home delivery service from restaurants. There were some terrible revelations about the way that they treat some of their drivers, and 1/3 of their investors walked away from them within 3 days. So we see an enormous focus on brand, and this focus on brand also impacts the way that we engage with our travelers and the way that our travelers see what's happening. Look at the impact from George Floyd last year and how we think now and how we are starting to think in a very positive way around inclusion, around our communities, and around how we communicate and interact with each other. And this lends itself to a focus for accountability and sustainability. You know, you should feel confident to take a position on carbon budgets and carbon profiles. There are digital tools that can help you. Let's take some responsibility and ownership for our programs and what we're doing. And by doing that, you can actually make this a mission critical situation for your business and give your travelers a sense of purpose in how they view what they're doing and the impact they're making. The time has come to accelerate your digital transformation. You're all doing something in this area. Some of you are looking at the ways that you bring content into your platforms. Some of them are looking at the ways that you manage profiles. Some of you are looking at the way that you interact with data, with planning, with loyalty programs. Some of you are looking at the way that you pay for things, the virtual tools you use. There's a lot of discussion around digital passports in different kinds of areas. All of these things should be embraced and pushed forward, because right now, this is the moment to do it. If you've got 18% international travel going on, then you can get these things rolled out, trained, and implemented. You can take these decisions. You're not going to have the same difficult conversations in some cases around impact costs and change management fees. You're not going to have the same difficulties in some cases around traveler resentment or around internal corporate barriers. Right, this is the moment to do it. You know, and it will hugely enhance your interactive communication and feedback and give you the data that you need to make change. And one of the big changes that everybody needs to be working on right now is shifting as much of their business to virtual payment as they possibly can. Virtual payment, mobile wallets, and contactless need to be embraced with the fervor of an 18-year-old having their first drink in the pub. That's how you need to be looking at this. Really going for it. Look at what's happening in the generations coming after us. They are already wildly embracing contactless and mobile solutions, and the COVID situation has pushed this forward tremendously. You know, because we don't want to touch anything, do we? So we've suddenly started embracing all kinds of solutions and tools, including the idea that you can walk in a restaurant and make your order before you sit down, and the waiter brings you your food because you want to use an app to do it. All this stuff that we're doing quite naturally, using our phones to check in at hotels. None of this is new tech. There's no new code here. We've just embraced code that was already there, and we're using it in a more synchronized way. One of the things that you can do as buyers and as suppliers is look at a process of payment orchestration in your businesses. Sync up the different processes you have around virtual money, whether it's payment, whether it's clearing, whether it's settlement, whether it's reconciliation. We should be moving into a world of controlled mobile virtual payment if we're not there already. And that's a world that suppliers should embrace just as strongly as corporate buyers. And it reflects the movement towards hybrid working practices that we've seen across now businesses. I was engaged with the Economic and Business Research Council's recent study, which was conducted in January and February on cities in the UK, and it was around the consequences of de-urbanisation. We've seen in London close to 700,000 people leave in the last year. 700,000 people have left. Right, we are anticipating in the UK, and the figures may be different in Belgium, that at least 20% of office workers will not return. And that doesn't mean that 20% of people are not coming back. It means probably most people will go towards some kind of hybrid type scenario where they are, a couple of days in, several days out, that kind of thing, which is going to change the way we think about our offices. It's going to change the way we think about commuting. It's going to change where that commuting is paid for. If I'm working 2 days out of 2 weeks in the office, for me, that's a business travel expense. That's not a commuting ticket. So that also will change the way that we look at that kind of thing. It changes where people feel they need to live. If I don't need to live 30 minutes away from the office because I'm only going there once every week or once every 2 weeks, then I can live somewhere that gives me better quality of life, but that may not be near that typical hub airport, or may change the place that we do a staff meeting, or change the focus around how we use the office at all. And this hybridity will also have impact on our local communities. There is a calculation in the study that I was part of called Zoom shock. It's a great invented word, but I think it's good. Now, Zoom shock calculates the relative balance of impact of revenue that leaves an area because people who were working in that area and spending money are no longer working there, and revenue that comes into an area because people who live there and were working something else are now working from home. And what you see when you make that calculation is a huge shift of revenue out of city centres into typically middle class or upper working class areas where there are people who have jobs with the capacity to work from home, and you see a sort of deurbanization process going on. And this hybridity will also reflect itself in, some of the dynamic processes we do, whether it's pricing, sourcing, or variable demand. The idea that we have any kind of reliable data for the next 2 years on which to base a corporate rate in a hotel or a corporate fare on an airline, good luck with that. So we're all going to have to learn to work in variable demand and dynamic sourcing engagements and environments. And this means that we all need to be more agile. Now, as a slightly fat, mid-50s gent, the idea of being agile is not something that I always embrace with the most enthusiasm, but I do think that even I can adopt an agile mindset. And adopting an agile mindset is taking the ability to think in a highly focused way on specific areas of confluence or opportunity, and to invest and drive resources towards those areas. We mustn't get trapped in rigid models. This is death. Anybody who turns around to you and says, "Oh, listen, we can't do the thing you want to do because that's not the way we do business," they're going to be in a museum next to a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton quite soon. That's they're done, right? So we need to think forwards, backwards, and forwards again. I'll give you a good example. If you've got a goal for your program of, for example, 90% of your travelers having a digital sustainable passport by 2023 January, where do you need to be by June 22 to be at the January 23 goal? Work that out? Good. And where do you need to be by December 21 to be at the June 22 goal? Work that out? Excellent. Then where do you need to be at, May 21 to be at the December goal? Oh, you've just written a business plan backwards. Now go forwards through it and start and try and eliminate the barriers and the traps and the things like that would stop you from being successful. Embrace local innovation. Don't try and be all globally holier than thou about it. Embrace local innovation, get them inside your tent, right? And be flexible commercially. Don't get trapped in single types of fee engagement. If you're working with your TMC, think about combinations of management fee, of subscription pricing, of enterprise fees, different models there. Think about different models with your airlines, some fixed fares, some dynamic prices, the same with the hotels. Try and be flexible commercially in the way that you work. Reevaluate, monitor, and engage your program constantly. And by moving your resources around, start to create agile working teams, highly focused, joined up people that you can shift from project to area to project to area, which will also make you much, much more effective. And finally, you really need to enable your travelers. Your travelers are a very worried bunch of people. First of all, they're worried that they might never travel again. That's point one, right? They're worried that they may kill their wife and their children, or their husband and their children, because they've never had to spend so much time at home in their lives, and it's driving everybody nuts, right? They're worried that when they do travel, they don't really know what they're going to need to do to travel. What kind of certificates do they need? What kind of passports? What kind of jabs? What's it going to be like somewhere else? So you need to start thinking in terms of safe space to safe space travel planning. It's not just about the airport or the hotel. It's also about the office. It's about the car. It's about the train. It's even, ladies and gentlemen, about the lift that they get into when they arrive at the premises. You've got to think about the full journey in the safe space to safe space environment and engage them frequently. Remember, there are a significant number of things that you won't know work, or you won't know that you need to change until you start to have some volumes traveling again. We don't really know what safe is until we see a lot of people traveling again, and then we'll have an idea, right? You know, I'll give you an example. In my own country here in London, our mayor in London talks a lot about how safe the underground is. That's because whenever you get on the underground, there's 2 people and a dog and a packet of crisps in the entire train. Of course it's safe, right? Let's see how safe it is in 6 months' time when, 3 million people are trying to get into London between 8 o'clock and 8:45 in the morning. And then it's a different conversation. So scalability is also a function here in terms of how you work. So as a kind of summary of some of these initiatives, and there are plenty others that we could talk about, some areas of focus for you, some areas of acceleration, sustainability, digital transition, virtual payments, hybrid working practices, the concept of hybridity in general. And if any of you are interested in the Zoom shock analysis, I will provide the paper to Pascal so we can load it up onto your site. And of course, the vital area of traveller enablement. So thank you so much for that time together. And hopefully I haven't gone too far over my allowance and you found it useful, and I'll open it back to Pascal at this point.
Thank you very much, Chris. This was very insightful, great presentation. Thank you very much for your partnership. I think we have not really received any questions, so we'll give it 2 more minutes for people to submit questions if they have any. There have been some great comments in the chat, so Chris, feel free to have a look at them. It's clear that a lot of people are agreeing with me that it was indeed a very insightful and excellent session that we just had, so that's great.
I think we should try and be positive, Pascal, in our forward thought. This is a good opportunity to do some of the things that we want to do. I mean, none of us in our professional lives have ever really had a moment where we've been able with some certainty to say business is going to be at a certain level for a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. Therefore, let's invest time and resource in build and design, right? That's an unusual position to be in. I think we should take advantage of it slightly gleefully. It's like that, having the chance to read that book you've always wanted to, or that kind of thing, right?
Absolutely. And we just received one question. So lots of GTMs report to procurement. So global travel managers report to procurement. How do they prove their value in a flexible and dynamic relationship with suppliers? Any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, they prove it in some of the ways they always have, with an understanding of total cost management, and of course a respect for personal liability of the traveller, liability of the company, safety, security, those kinds of things. They prove it in their processes for ensuring that they have the right suppliers to provide the right services at the right time. So making strong analysis on business continuity across their supply chain on a continuous basis is an important role and function that they need to take. They also need to prove it by engaging much more wholeheartedly with Treasury and with finance around the way that things are paid for and the money is costed and accounted. Policy is still important, but policy also needs to be driven by demand and less by habit. And that's a very difficult situation to get into, but you can help yourself there by having more of a cost center to cost center kind of understanding of how travel works and relationships between those areas. I think engagement demonstrates a lot of value, in particular engagement that brings in different areas of focus for a company. And here's where things like sustainability and digital can be very important and key in demonstrating a wider value than purely negotiating the rate in the hotel. So I think for procurement, there's actually more opportunity to demonstrate value now than there was in what was largely a kind of dormant model prior to this. But it will require quite a lot of lateral thinking, a lot of good reading, and a lot more engagement. And I think so. There's also perhaps a slight change in mindset that some folks will have to adopt. But I think it's really healthy. I don't feel that people should be afraid of it. Embrace it. Be positive about it. My younger sister is a travel manager for a merchant bank in the UK that specialises in travel into Central Africa and Central Asia. And she, after consulting with her seniors, has expanded her role to include personal security on travellers, which was so heavily impacted by COVID and changing regulations. And they are putting her through a university course in this while she works. And so she will have 2 strings to her procurement bow when she comes out. And I think that's a great example of how this situation can actually expand your role and make you more impactful and give you more latitude in a way to pursue the right kind of agenda.
No, and I agree. It's a kind of a reset that we're going through, right? So if you do it in a positive, constructive, open vision way, there's certainly going to be a lot of opportunity for our industry whenever we come out of this, because we will be able to reshape our industry completely and make it much better than it was before. And it's an easier reshape to some degree because you obviously have less volume to deal with. It's easier to implement change to some extent. So absolutely great. We have come to the end of our 45 minutes that we have planned for this afternoon. So Chris, once more, thank you very much for your presentation and the partnership today. Wish you all the best. For everybody on the phone, thank you very much for joining. Stay tuned. There's more webinars to come in the upcoming weeks. You'll get all the information as soon as possible. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a great rest